evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us for what promises to be yet another exciting public lecture hosted by ASU Jewish Studies. I'm Chabat Samuelson, and I'm the Director of Jewish Studies here at ASU. I'm also Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History. As many of you know, if you've been with us in the last few months, in November and December, we hosted Professor Gary Rensburg of Rutgers University for a lecture series on 1,000 years of Jewish history. Now, Professor Rensburg really gave us terrific 3 lectures, and those lectures focused on ancient history. And I should say in general that our lectures usually focus more on history, but tonight it's different. And tonight's lecture is going to be on contemporary Jewish life and the challenges that Jews face today. We're very honored and grateful to host Professor Noah Feldman, who is Felix Frankfurter of Law, Professor of Law and Director of Julius Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli law at Harvard Law School. At Harvard, he also serves as chair of the Society of Fellows, and he's a co-chair of the Institutional Voice Working Group. Professor Feldman received his undergraduate degree at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard. That was 92. He was then selected as a Rhodes Scholar and earned his doctorate degree in Islamic thought from Oxford University in England. That was 1994. He then returned to the United States and completed his legal training at Yale Law School, where he received his JD degree in 1997. And during the years he was at Yale, he served as the book review editor of the Yale Law Journal. Many of you may know that he also, after he finished law school, he served as a law clerk with the Supreme Court Justice David Souter. That was 1998, 1999. Then he worked as an advisor. He was a senior constitutional advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. That's quite an incredible range of activities here. And in that capacity, he advised members of the Iraqi Governing Council on the drafting of the Transitional Administrative Law and the interim constitution. He's a member, Professor Feldman is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and a very, very influential scholar and public intellectual. He's written 10 books. I'm not going to read you all the titles of those books, but 3 perhaps would be of interest to many people. So a book from 2005 is Divided by God, America's Church-State Problem and What We Should Do About It. That's 205. Another book from 2013 is Cold War, The Future of Global Competition. And a later book, The Arab Winter, that came out with Princeton University Press in 2020. The book that will concern us tonight is his most recent one, To Be a Jew Today, a New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People. And that's really a terrific title that is of interest to many people. So we are very excited to have Professor Feldman with us. And I would like to thank my colleague, Professor Daniel Rothenberg. Daniel, maybe you can let us see your face. So Professor Daniel Rothenberg, who facilitated this lecture. So Professor Rothenberg is a professor of practice at the School of Politics and Global Studies, and he's the co-director with Peter Bergen of the Center on the Future of War. This is a center that is here at ASU, but also does a lot of work in Washington, D.C. So please place your questions and comments in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Try not to use the chat, use the Q&A function. And Professor Feldman, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Samuelson, very much for that very generous introduction. Thank you also to Professor Rothenberg. Jan and I have now known each other for well over 20 years and have had many, many rich conversations, at least rich for me, about everything under the sun, but including questions of Judaism and Jewishness and its relationship to the contemporary world. And as Professor Samuelson said, in this book, for the first time ever in my career, even though I've been working on Jewish subjects and studying Jewish subjects since I was a boy, I actually decided to take on the question of contemporary Jewish life. And the reason that I wanted to do that was partly that as I began to write it, I was at the stage of life where my kids were about to go off to university. And it occurred to me as they approached that point in their lives that things for them on campus and their life experiences in connection with Jewishness were going to be extraordinarily different than they were for me roughly 30 years ago when I was an undergraduate. And that really got me thinking about what had changed and what had stayed the same. And it led me to the topic of the book that Professor Samuelson mentioned, which is called To Be a Jew Today. And for me, the words to be imply the end of Hamlet's conundrum, to be or not to be. And the reason that I want to bring that up is that I think for many, many centuries, for the overwhelming majority of Jews in the world, there was no question of whether to be a Jew or not to be, merely by virtue of the fact that you were born into a society which classified you as Jewish. That meant you would spend your life within the confines of the Jewish community. And even if you chose to leave by joining another religion, you could still be identified as a Jew, culturally or ethnically. And so there was, in some sense, no escape from being Jewish. And that means that the question of whether one needed a reason to be a Jew, I think, didn't arise in the same way that arises in the contemporary world. Today, in contrast, for certainly my kids' generation, living in the United States, the great majority of people who are born Jewish and think of themselves as Jewish also have the option of choosing not to be Jewish and not to think of themselves as Jewish. And if they choose to walk away, there will be nobody to insist to them that they are genuinely Jewish against their will. And so for this generation, perhaps more than in a long time, the question of why be a Jew is, I think, central and important. And I would add to that that in a world of rising anti-Semitism and other forms of sentiment that can make it difficult or uncomfortable to be a Jew, there are also some reasons why some people might feel they desire not to be seen as Jewish. And so, again, the question of why be a Jew arises. And so I organized the book around that question, around the question of why should one choose to be Jewish? And in the first part of the book, which is a part of the book about God, I survey 4 different ways that you could think about being Jewish that would give you reasons and ways to be Jewish, each of which is very different from the other. And I'll talk about that part of the book in just a moment, give you a brief summary of it. Then in the second part of the book, I talk about Israel. And I make the argument that one of the ways that being Jewish has changed drastically in the last couple of generations is that today, in a way that was never true before in history, for many, many Jews living in Israel, living in the United States, and living in other countries, identification with and connection to Israel has become the centerpiece of their Jewishness. In other words, it's become part of their answer to the question of why be a Jew. And so I will talk about that aspect of Jewish life and both the opportunities and the great challenges that that poses in the second part of my comments. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk about the Jewish people as a people. And in that context, I will say a few words about Jews as a family. And spoiler alert, I'm going to suggest to you that the Jews as a people are a large, loving, and somewhat dysfunctional family. And I'll have a lot to say about what that means and the implications of it. So with your permission, let me start at the beginning with the question of God. Now, I want to acknowledge that for many, many Jews today, they can identify and describe their Jewishness without any reference to God. And I'm going to talk about that. And for other Jews who actually do think that religious practice and God, however they choose to understand God, is important to their Jewish lives, there can be some reticence about being prepared to talk about it. And interestingly, that's not only in what I would call progressive Jewish circles, where people might be skeptical whether God exists or whether they might think that God is a rather metaphorical or abstract spiritual principle. But it's even true for much more traditional Jews. And the reason for that is that if you are a follower of traditionalist Judaism, what I call traditionalist Judaism, then it's true that you have to begin with the belief that God gave the Torah to the children of Israel at Mount Sinai in a moment of covenant. And you also have to believe that as part of that covenant, God assigned the authority to interpret his binding words to a group of people who evolved into the rabbis, and that those rabbis represent an unbroken tradition. That's why I call these Jews traditionalists, going all the way back to the beginning. So God is in there, and to be a genuine traditionalist, you do have to believe in God. But once you've made that assertion, even though in the liturgy you would pray to God at least 3 times a day, you could go through much of your daily life without thinking too much about God directly, because God is represented to modern traditionalist Jews through the body of laws, the halakha, that constitute the 4 corners of traditionalist Jewish life. And through the Talmud and subsequent rabbinic writing, traditionalist Jews have learned to focus upon what they ought to do as a central component of what makes them Jewish. Now, that's not the whole of traditionalist Judaism. It also includes Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism, which can itself provide reasons to be Jewish. It can include Jewish philosophy, which can also provide reasons to be Jewish. And even for some, though not very many traditionalist Jews, it can entail commitment to Israel in ways that I will try to come back to and discuss a little bit later. Nevertheless, it is possible to say relatively little about God in a direct fashion. Now, there's a tremendous and beautiful feature of traditionalist Judaism, and that is that its adherents genuinely experience themselves as part of an authentic community that is nearly all-encompassing and which provides a sense of belonging and a sense of joy in living one's life in the way that one is confident that God has wanted us to live as people for thousands of years, and also in continuity, or imagined continuity in some cases, with the way Jewishness has traditionally been. And I think it's hugely important to acknowledge the appeal of that sense of authenticity, because at the end of the Holocaust, many, many people predicted that traditionalist Judaism would disappear. Millions of traditionalist Jews had died in the Holocaust or been murdered in the Holocaust, and the number of traditionalist Jews who remained was relatively small. Israel had been founded by largely secular Jews. Most American Jews had moved away from traditionalist practice. And yet, in direct violation of those predictions, and really against the odds, traditionalist Judaism has turned out to be the fastest growing part of Judaism through much of that period of time. And its institutions, like traditional yeshivas, are burgeoning and succeeding in the world today, in the United States and in Israel and elsewhere, in ways that would have been genuinely unimaginable to our European forebears. So given its success as a movement, traditionalist Judaism needs to be taken very seriously, needs to be respected. At the same time, for those of us who live in liberal democratic societies, there are some challenges associated with traditionalism. And those challenges are the incompatibility of certain parts of traditionalism with modern liberal ideas. Traditionalism is not open to equality for women, so women cannot be rabbis, cannot be counted in the minyan, cannot be called to the Torah, and so forth and so on. It's not really open to modern liberal conceptions of equal rights for gay people. It can barely imagine the situation of trans people. And for Jews who are born into traditionalist Jewish life and find that they're gay or that they're trans or that they're women who would like to be treated equally, it's often impossible to find a way of being a traditionalist Jew that is ultimately satisfying. And so I think that is the biggest challenge that traditionalist Judaism faces today. And to be clear, it's not so much a challenge for the believers who are very happy with where they are and don't feel challenged by these questions. It's a challenge for those on the outside or for those who are inside the community and wish that it would liberalize, which it steadfastly refuses to do, and I think will never do. From there, let me talk about another form of Jewishness, which I've mentioned already, called progressive Jewishness. In my nomenclature, a progressive Jew is anyone who believes that the covenant at Sinai, in some important symbolic way, captures God's special relationship with the Jewish people, and that the laws laid down in the Torah and interpreted by the rabbis are the product of specific human efforts to make sense of God at that particular moment in time. And for a progressive Jew, that would also include the Bible, which is seen as perhaps divinely inspired, but not specifically divinely authored. And so for progressive Jews, the key is to find the ethical core of Judaism. And that ethical core is consonant with the messages of the greatest of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. It is wisdom at a general level. It is justice, especially social justice, as captured in the biblical adage, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shalt thou pursue. And it's captured in the mystical slogan of tikkun olam, the repair of the world, which in the context of progressive Judaism is expanded to mean improving the lives of all of those around us, what we might call leaving the world a better place than we have found it. And so for progressive Jews, if they see aspects of the tradition that are beautiful, they're happy to preserve those aspects of the tradition. But if they see aspects of the tradition that seem immoral to us, given our current morality, they're happy to respectfully and gently put those parts of the tradition aside, because those parts are not the essential part of Jewishness for them. Now, progressive Judaism has more adherents today than any other form of Judaism. And that's despite the fact that since its invention in the context of Reform Judaism almost 200 years ago in Germany, other Jews have been predicting that progressive Judaism would come to an end because there would be no Jews left because people wouldn't take their Jewishness seriously enough. And it's been 200 years, and not only has that not happened, but progressive Jewishness is certainly in the United States by far the largest denomination of Jews, and depending on how you interpret it, it may be the largest denomination of Jews anywhere. So it's not going anywhere, and it's not going anywhere because it gives people an opportunity to be proudly and fully committed to their Jewishness, while simultaneously living as modern people with modern liberal values and updating themselves. The challenge faced by progressive Judaism is that in its institutional form, it can be difficult for it to differentiate itself from other forms of progressive religion, say progressive liberal Protestantism of the kind you would find in Unitarian Universalism, or even in some of the other mainline Protestant denominations. What I mean here is that the challenge for progressive Judaism is to say what is distinctively and particularistically Jewish without, in so doing, undermining the universalist teachings of the prophets that progressive Jews are deeply connected to. So you'll see that as for traditionalism, I'm trying to identify both beautiful features of progressive Judaism as well as more challenging features. Now, in between the traditionalists and the progressives are people whom I call evolutionist Jews. And those are Jews who accept the binding nature of God's law, the same way traditionalists do, and accept the binding nature of the biblical laws and the binding nature of the rabbinic teachings interpreting them, but who simultaneously also believe that it is up to human beings to interpret those binding laws, and that it's permissible to interpret those laws in the light of our contemporary moral judgments. Some people who would call themselves modern Orthodox Jews might fit into this description. Now, this, to my mind, and this is the strand of Judaism in which I was raised, is very, very noble because it's seeking to do both. It's seeking to honor the tradition and honor the law, and it's seeking to take into account modern contemporary moral developments. And evolutionist Judaism also faces challenges perhaps deeper even than those faced by either traditionalists or the progressives, because evolutionist Jews have to keep in mind at all times two things that are almost contradictory, namely that the tradition is binding and that the tradition evolves. And so they have to take on every contemporary problem and struggle with it. They have to struggle with the question of whether there should be women rabbis. And some think the answer is yes, and some think the answer is no. They have to struggle with the question of gay marriage in Judaism. Many evolutionist Jews can't see their way to permitting Jews to marry in a traditional ceremony that is a gay ceremony, but others do see a way to do that and try to be creative with the Jewish tradition in order to get there. And those are just examples of the kinds of challenges that evolutionist Jews face. And then there are the people whom I call godless Jews. And those are Jews who, no matter what their preference of how to live as Jews might be, feel that their Jewishness doesn't depend on any commitment to the divine at all. Modern Zionism began as a secular movement, and in its secularism, it tried to put aside God. And that's one of the reasons that Zionism has been such a big tent movement, because you can be a religious Jew and be a Zionist, or you can be a completely secular Jew and be a Zionist. But to the earliest Zionists, the whole point of Zionism was to take what had been a religion and transform that religion into a nationalist movement that, among other things, would be modern and up to date, would create sovereignty for the Jewish people, which the Jewish people had not had in a couple of thousand years, and simultaneously would overcome the question of what it means to be a Jew religiously, because they would say, we don't need to have belief in God, we don't need to have religious practice, we can instead have language, culture, and sovereign nationality. And then there are other strands as well. There are some socialist, godless Jews. Karl Marx was one. There are some psychoanalytically oriented cultural Jews. Sigmund Freud was one. And then there are what I call with love bagels and lox Jews. And I have a whole section of my book in praise of the bagels and lox Jew, because I think that is a kind of Judaism that is bound up in Jewish culture and a deep connection to Jewish cultural practices. And that, I think, too, is desirable. So to conclude my description of these different kinds of Jewishness that we see today, I would just say the approach that I take in the book is not to tell you which one you should be, but to get you to ask yourself, which one am I? And you might be more than one. And the reason I think that's important is that you won't know why you should be a Jew or why you want to be a Jew unless you first answer the question of where your Jewishness is coming from and what its purposes are. Now, let me turn to Israel, which is in some ways the most challenging aspect of Jewish life today, both in the meaning that it infuses for so many Jews and in the challenges that that form of meaning creates. As I mentioned, modern Israel was created by Zionists who, for the most part, themselves secular, and they didn't think that religion was a necessary part of Judaism to a great extent. There were a tiny number of religious Zionist Jews who were kind of a species of the evolutionist Jews that I was talking about, and those Jews have grown in numbers substantially in Israel, but they were not central to Zionist experience in the early years of the state. Now, one of the central aspirations of Zionism was to put an end to anti-Semitism. Now, you may say that seems like a strange aspiration, since after all, one of the reasons that Zionism was necessary was that Jews had been subject to anti-Semitism in one form or another for the entirety of post-biblical Jewish history. And Zionists believed that Jews needed a state of their own to protect themselves from anti-Semitism. And that's all true. But Zionists also believed that if Jews would become a nation like other nations and no longer live as a marginalized minority in non-Jewish places, that the reasons for anti-Semitism would disappear. And that was a beautiful aspiration, not totally implausible on its face, but it didn't work out that way. And the reason it didn't work out that way is that Israel is a Jewish state by its own self-definition. Its Declaration of Independence says it should be Jewish and democratic, but part of that is Jewish. And because the history of Jewishness and the narratives and myths of Jewishness are bound up with the narratives and myths of Christianity and Islam, the consequence is that everywhere where there are Muslims and everywhere where there are Christians, and they're together, you're counting for well over 3 billion people in the world, people's conception of Israel inevitably is bound up in their conception of Jewishness. What used to be called the so-called Jewish question, which was the question of what should happen to Jews as a people once Jews were entitled to full civil and political rights in the countries in which they lived, it's a 19th century and 20th century question, evolved into today what you might call the Israel question, which is the question of the status of Israel as a democratic state and its relationship with other countries and with its neighbors. And that in turn has come to be bound up with the Israel-Palestine question, which is at the most basic level, the question of how these two peoples can coexist, if indeed they can coexist, in a space that each claims as its national homeland and as its fundamental birthright from the standpoint of self-determination. Those ongoing challenges are the reason that Israel has not magically caused the problem of anti-Semitism to go away, coupled with the reality that the abstract idea of Israel as an ideal is one thing, and then the actual reality of Israel is that it is a real country with a real army, with real problems, and all of the challenges that one could ordinarily expect. And that means that Jews around the world who love Israel and those around the world, Jewish or otherwise, who don't love Israel, can't simply be relying on their abstract ideas of the place. They have to be also in some way in relationship to its practical reality. And that makes things extraordinarily challenging. Now, to me, the most significant developments about Israel's relationship to Jews and the rest of the world in recent years is the one that I mentioned a bit earlier, namely that for so many Jews today, whether they're traditionalist or whether they're progressive or whether they're evolutionist or godless, Israel has come to be at the core of their Jewishness. There was a time, say 50 years ago, where you could be a Jew not living in Israel who didn't particularly think about Israel very much one way or the other. That is simply not the case today. And you can just ask yourselves, if you're on this call, that means you're at least interested in Jews, especially in the time since last October 7th in 2023. Is there an option for you to say, yeah, I'm just not like that focused on Israel one way or the other? And I think the answer is no. And that's true for people who care about Israel. And it's also for people who are deeply frustrated with Israel. And it's even true for those Jews who are actively anti-Zionist and in certain ways deeply criticize or even reject the state of Israel. They too are forming their identities around Israel. And just to give you a practical sense of what it means to say that Israel has become central to people's Jewishness, we do a little thought experiment. Picture whatever temple or synagogue you last set foot in, whenever that was. And then imagine that the rabbi got up and gave a sermon, and he or she began by saying, you know, some days I think to myself, maybe there is no God. Would everyone go into a panic by that formulation? I think the answer is mostly not even in traditionalist synagogues. It would help if the rabbi concluded by saying, but, you know, on the whole, I realize that there is, or on the whole, I try to act as though there is a God, or all the other things that the rabbi could say as part of that sermon. Now ask yourself what would happen if the same rabbi got up and began a sermon by saying, some days I can't help myself. I think the state of Israel shouldn't exist. I think in most synagogues and temples in the United States, that rabbi would be out of a job, not days later, but by the end of the services. If you can imagine something that a clergy person could say that would get them fired, now you're close to the content of irreducible beliefs of a given religious tradition. And I think that thought example should suffice to show that that's true. Now, the biggest challenge that's facing young American Jews today, and it's really a challenge facing all Jews because there's a generational conflict going on, is that many young progressive Jews who were raised to believe that their liberal social democratic values are the values of Judaism struggle with the way that Israel, as it currently exists in the real world, seems to them not to correspond to the values of liberal democracy. And events in Gaza after October 7, the Gaza war, has deepened that feeling for many in that generation. But that feeling was already building by virtue of the fact that Israel was created in 1948, and in 1967, in the wake of the Six-Day War, it took control over the West Bank, which Israel today calls Judea and Samaria, as well as Gaza. And since that time, Israel has maintained de facto sovereignty over the West Bank. And many Israelis today are calling for actual annexation, the formally making the West Bank or parts of it part of Israel. And Palestinians who live within Israel are entitled to full legal equality in Israel. They vote. They're entitled to equality before the law. They're entitled to due process of law. They're equal citizens of the state, notwithstanding that there is some discrimination against Palestinian Israelis, the same way there's discrimination against minorities in many countries in the world. But Palestinians who live in Gaza or who live in the West Bank, under Israeli law and under international law, are treated as citizens of occupied territory, and therefore are not citizens of the state of Israel, and therefore are not entitled to political rights. They're not entitled to the right to vote, and they're not entitled to the full panoply of civil rights that other Israelis are entitled to. And so for many, many, many young Jews, progressive Jews, that situation is inconsistent with Israel being a liberal democracy. And so those young Jews think, if my Judaism is the same as my liberal democratic values, and if Israel is not a liberal democratic state, how can I remain as committed to Israel as a Jewish state as, say, my parents and perhaps my grandparents are? That's a generational conflict in which my generation of Jews, the Gen Xers, and then my parents' generation, the boomers, consistently often think that the younger generation, the Gen Z generation, are missing the real story because they've only seen Israel in a secure place, and they're focusing on the apparent injustice to Palestinians without thinking about the context in which that injustice arose. They're not thinking about the difficulties that Israel had trying to negotiate a peace deal with Palestinians at the time that Bill Clinton was trying to get Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin to make a deal. And so for those generations of Jews, there's a lot of frustration with the younger generation. Meanwhile, the younger generation, the Gen Z folks, they think that the older generations have lost the thread. They think that those generations are so committed to the state of Israel that they've been caught up in an old narrative of what Israel used to be like, and that they're not actually picturing an Israel that presently really exists. And that generation points to the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which is by far the most right-wing government that presently exists, that has ever existed in the history of Israel. It has several members of the cabinet who are committed to annexation of parts of the West Bank. It has members of the cabinet who fundamentally don't believe in the political equality of any Palestinians. And seen from that perspective, it becomes difficult to imagine how Israel could ever satisfy the conditions of liberal democracy. That's a debate about Israel, but it's also a debate about what it is to be Jewish, precisely because Israel has come to be so central to Jewish life in the United States and elsewhere. And I would call that the most painful intergenerational conflict that's going on among Jews today. That brings me to the last part of the book and the last part of what I want to say, which is the question of Jews as a people. And I mentioned that I think the right way to think of Jews as a people is to think of Jews as a family. Now, by family, I don't just mean the old-fashioned idea that a family are the people you're genetically related to. Actually, that was never completely an adequate definition of family. I mean a contemporary family. And by that, I mean a family that's composed by marriage, that's composed by adoption, that's composed by choices and friends and associations. And it's the kind of family where the boundaries are not certain. And to see what I mean, you can ask yourself, who is in my own family? And then you can ask yourself, would all of the people that I think of as my family also agree that we are a family? And will they also agree in the boundaries of who is in the family and who is not in the family? And in a contemporary modern family, that's a pretty hard thing to show. In fact, most of the time, there's some uncertainty around it because our families are not the stereotypical families that we imagine from the past, again, if they ever really were there. And I'll just give you a concrete example of this from my own life. We don't even have a word in ordinary American English to describe the following person who is a part of my life and my family. And that is my ex-wife's husband's mother, who, by the way, I have a wonderful relationship with and is a wonderful bonus grandmother to my children, and whom I sit across from often at Passover, at the Seder, and who in a meaningful way is a member of my family. But it's not entirely obvious under what definition of family that would be the case, other than the one I'm offering, which is an inclusive, agglomerative, real-world definition of family. Notice that when I say the Jews are a family like that, it helps explain why we have uncertainty sometimes about who is in and who's outside of that family. Different movements within Judaism have different views about who is a Jew and who is not a Jew. That's a hotly debated topic in Israel, as a matter of fact. And it also helps explain the relationship between Jews outside of Israel and Jews inside of Israel, whose care for each other often resembles that of care that we have for a family. Now, here's the core, to me, of the argument of what I hope you'll take away from this book and from my talk. And it's this. Families are where we find our first experiences of love. And the Jewish family is a loving family. Jews are commanded to love God, Jews are told that God loves them, and Jews are told that they should love one another. And that is true. Those elements of fellow feeling and connection genuinely exist among Jews. We do love each other. And families are also where we have our first archetypal experiences of struggle. And we Jews also struggle with one another. And we struggle with God, whether we believe in God or not. And especially if we're not sure if we believe in God, we struggle. But if we do believe in God, we struggle with whether God is just. If we do believe in God, we struggle with what God wants from us. If we go in and out of belief with God, we're struggling with God's existence. If we absolutely disbelieve in God, we're still struggling with God because then we're struggling with God's absence. Now, this idea that Judaism involves both love and struggle is, for me, the essence of what it is to be a Jew today. It's to love and struggle together with other Jewish people in trying to make sense of what it means to be Jewish. Unless you think that I just made that idea up, it comes directly out of the Bible. Because in the Bible, we see that in the very moment that Jacob is renamed Israel, he spends a long night struggling with a being whom the text sometimes calls a man, and sometimes calls an angel, and sometimes calls a god or God. And at the end of that night of struggle, Jacob captures this being and says to the being, I will not let thee go unless thou bless me. And then the being blesses Jacob and says, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but it shall be called Israel, because you have struggled or wrestled with men and gods, and you have prevailed. To me, that story of Jacob's struggle is the essence of what makes Israelites Israelites and Jews Jews. It's the reality of the capacity to struggle even when one experiences love. Now, I just want to conclude by saying that is not an easy path to take, theologically speaking. If you compare Judaism in that way to Christianity or to Islam or to Buddhism, you'll see why those faiths have billions of members, and Jews have perhaps some 25 million Jews around the world. It would be a little bit more if it weren't for the Holocaust, but it still wouldn't be in numbers that even vaguely began to compare to those other great faith traditions. So why is that? Well, Christianity teaches of a God who can be conceptualized as pure love. And Islam teaches of a God who can be conceptualized as requiring pure obedience in exchange for pure and absolute mercy. Even in Buddhism, we have the image of the Arhat, the almost godlike Buddha, who is able to put aside the things of this world. Those are very beautiful aspirations, and they're very appealing aspirations for human beings. And what does Judaism offer in their place? Well, no human being in Jewish tradition ever turns out to be perfect. Moses, is constantly complaining about the Israelites. He loses his temper and disobeys God. He's prohibited from entering the promised land. King David is an adulterer and a murderer, and God punishes him for that by saying that he shall not build the temple, and that eventually his children will be punished for his sins, and so on and so forth. And even God in the Jewish tradition, as depicted in the Bible, struggles in his relationship with the people of Israel. The God of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, calls himself a jealous God. And in the most extreme formulation that you see in the book of Hosea, that God compares himself to a husband of an unfaithful wife, and then that God commands the prophet Hosea to imitate God and to marry a woman who will be unfaithful to him. And the prophet does it, and she is, and they suffer mightily. And God says to the prophet, you see, this is what it's like for me to suffer in my love for the Israelite people and for the Jewish people, who just can't bring themselves to follow my will, but who sin and who are punished, and whom I send away for their sins into exile and diaspora. Now, that is not what you would call a model relationship, but it is the relationship that the Bible depicts between God and the Jewish people, because it's a relationship of love and a relationship of struggle. So if you ask, what kind of person would want to belong to a religious tradition that instead of offering the beauties of pure love or pure mercy or of enlightenment, instead sees a life that includes love and sometimes enlightenment, but also struggle? The answer is that a person who would follow that tradition is a person who is comfortable with the idea that our relationship with the divine or the spiritual should parallel the relationships that we know from actual human life, where the people whom we know and love the most are also the people with whom we struggle the most. And those kinds of people who accept that those things happen in the real world and who can look that straight in the face and live lives of meaning and value in the presence of that difficult and complicated reality are the people whom we call Jews. And for me, to be a Jew today is, no matter where you're coming from in the Jewish world, whether you're a godless Jew or a traditionalist Jew or a progressive Jew, no matter what, to know that you're joining your family, the Jewish people, in love and in struggle is the essence of what it is to be a Jew. And it's good enough. I'll close on that note and go to the Q&A to answer some questions. As Professor Samuelson said, please put your questions in the Q&A rather than in the chat, and I will try to work my way through them. And I won't repeat the whole question because I'm not mistaken, you can all see the Q&A as well.
No, they can't,
Oh,
but
they can't see
also
the
I
Q&A.
would
Okay.
like Daniel to ask his first question if you
Sorry,
don't.
forgive me. Daniel's going to ask the first question, then I'll go to the Q&A, and I will read the questions out since you can't see them. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Samuelson. It's great. You run such amazing speaker series, and it's great to see you this evening.
Daniel, we need it a bit higher. It's hard to
Louder.
hear
Maybe I'll
you.
just get closer. I'll talk louder. How's that? Is that better?
There you
Yeah.
go.
Okay. So
The Jewish Studies program. You don't have to worry about being too loud.
Professor Samuelson, thank you so much. I really, the programming is phenomenal you put together, and Lisa is great at doing that as well. And Professor Feldman, it's always good to see you. The book it's a great book. It's a very meaningful book for a lot of us. It certainly resonated strongly with me when I first read it, and then I read it again before this evening. The book focuses on the core of to be a Jew today as something to do with the struggle. You did a phenomenal job of actually going over the book, and hopefully that doesn't dissuade people from buying it. But I'm wondering, you're a crisp thinker always about big subjects, and your presentation is always enormously articulate. It's deeply intellectual. This talk, even more than my read of the book, picked up on the thing I really wanted to ask you, which is, do you think that there is a fundamentally, not intellectual, not textual, not scriptural core to what it means to be a Jew today, but a fundamentally aesthetic core? And if so, what might that mean?
Thank you, Daniel, for that really interesting question. Let me start by saying that I started writing the book thinking about finding an intellectual core, because as you pointed out, that's sort of, I was trained as an intellectual historian studying Islamic history and Jewish history, and I'm a law professor. So in the law, we spend all of our time trying to come up with coherent theories for things. And so that's how I started. And by the time I was done with the book, I realized that the true core of Jewishness is at least as much emotional as it is intellectual. And I'm going to use this to get to the aesthetic. And to see that, you can just think of the Shema, right? I mean, the Shema begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." You could say that that's an intellectual claim, depending on how you interpret it. It could be a declaration of monotheism. So maybe that's an idea, maybe that's intellectual. And then what comes next? "And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your might." Almost no intellectual content to that. That's emotional content. right? There is a God. That's an abstract statement. And then what should you do about that? You should feel love. And that love should be in your heart, and it should be in your soul, and it should come with effort. And I think in my Judaism, I think I failed until probably pretty recently in my Jewish life to really take on board the emotional components for what they are. I felt them intensely, but I was engaged in some practice of trying to deny them. And if you really think about it, why on earth would one live one's life according to a set of values or ideals or in a certain community if it didn't make you feel a certain way? You know, I mean, feeling is essential to that. And I think the same is true of family. You know, I mean, we're not part of families because we have an intellectual idea of the value of families. We're part of families because we have feelings towards our families. Feelings that are, we hope, as positive as they can possibly be most of the time, but sometimes aren't positive. So how does this lead to an answer to your question, Daniel, about the aesthetic? Well, I think that there is tremendous beauty in a life well lived. And a life well lived is not just a life lived according to some abstract principles. Imagine that you saw a person who was, let's say, a mathematician and spent all of his or her time thinking about the abstract principles of math and then interacted with all the people, let's call it his life, according to these abstract mathematical principles. Would we say that person had lived a life that was well lived? We'd probably say they had an amazing intellectual life. But I think if they hadn't been able to form close, meaningful human bonds of love and of struggle and of connection, we would probably say, well, that person maybe hasn't lived the best life that that person could have lived. Then we see a person who's loved and felt connected, but maybe that person wasn't living a life with very clear, crisp, abstract intellectual principles. I think we could very well still think that that person had lived a life very well. And how would we know which is a well-lived life? That's an aesthetic. That's a kind of sense of what is the beautiful way to live one's life. And I think if you ask yourself, well, what gives my life value and meaning and beauty? That's a kind of an aesthetic question. And that aesthetic question requires feeling and emotion, and it requires love. And it also, I don't think it would be a life well lived if it were all perfect all the time. First of all, nobody's life is actually like that. So when we meet someone who says, oh, my life is perfect, we all think the same thing. Oh, you're self-deluding. Real human life isn't perfect. So we need an aesthetic that is open to the imperfect and open to the struggle that comes alongside of love. And so for me, that's the aesthetic core of the book. It's an aesthetics of how to live a rich and meaningful life that would be a Jewish life. So I don't know if that satisfies you, Daniel, but unless you want to follow up, I'll go to the Q&A and start answering some other questions.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Okay. So the first question is about godless Jews and raises the question that Jack Silver asks, did you consider the secular movements like the Workman's Circle and secular humanistic Judaism? And yes, I absolutely do. And please don't take my word for it. You can take Daniel's. I was really just giving you the very, very simplest overview of the book. I actually go in some depth into the socialist forms of Jewishness, which actually go all the way back to 19th century Europe, and the organization in Europe called the Bund, which wanted to treat Jewishness as an ethnicity or a national identity, but not one connected to Zionism, instead one connected to other peoples who would be joined in socialist solidarity. And the Workman's Circle is the American version of the imported European version of that. And secular humanistic Judaism is also a really fascinating movement because it's ambivalent about whether to call itself Jewish at all. You know, if something is genuinely secular, then in principle, what that means, if it's a worldview, is that it does not consider God to be part of its calculus of how to understand the world. Things are a little bit different where we're talking about the secular state, but I'm talking about if a person says, I am secular, that person is in principle saying, I do not consider God to be an important part of my self-conception. So if one is secular, not bringing God in, and one is a humanist, which means one is a universalist to include all human beings, then what exactly is added by saying Judaism? And of course, the short answer is that a huge percentage of people who call themselves secular humanists are actually Jewish. When they gather together in their secular, and this is true of the movement of secular humanism as it was founded in the United States by figures like Felix Adler, who was himself the son of a rabbi, and in an important way was transmuting progressive Jewish ideas into the idea of secular humanism. So secular humanism is a great example to me of a movement that is extremely Jewish, even as it presents itself as in certain respects not Jewish. And that's how you get the fascinating paradox of secular humanist Judaism. Next question. I'm just going through these at present, roughly in the order in which they appeared. So I'll try to answer them quickly to get to all of them. Adam Cohen asks about the First Amendment implications of the observation that for many Jews, God has little to do with it. I think the Supreme Court, on the whole, has been open to manifestations of Jewishness without asking too closely the question of, but what exactly do you believe? Sometimes in religious exemption cases, the court does seem to be interested in what people believe, but that's a difficult thing for the court to answer, and the court's usually embarrassed to ask that question, doesn't usually want to bring you up onto the stand and ask you, what do you actually believe? So I think if you assert that you're doing something on the basis of your Jewish faith, that's ordinarily enough for the courts. If a modern Jew is a confirmed atheist, asks John Eckstein, why believe in the Torah as an ethical or historical guide? The Torah is God-centered. If God doesn't exist, why even consider the Torah? Wouldn't it be better to follow the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the source of ethical beliefs? Well, I mean, the short answer is that you're absolutely right to say that if one's Jewishness depends entirely on God, then one would have the option of saying, I'm not interested in the Bible or the rabbi's interpretation of the Bible because it is very God-centered. There's no question it's profoundly God-centered. And there's sort of an answer to that too, which is to say, well, this is a tradition that if you identify as a Jew is your tradition. And if you don't believe in God, then you don't think God composed the Bible. You think humans composed the Bible, and the Bible is a series of myths. But those myths are the Jewish myths. You know, one could be a modern Greek, or not even a Greek, just a person who loves to read classical works and think that the Odyssey and the Iliad are myths of tremendous power, and maybe even organize your life around them to some degree, or let's say around the views of Socrates. Without having to believe that the gods depicted in the Odyssey and the Iliad were real or ever were real. So attaching yourself to the biblical tradition, if you're not a believer, depends on feeling that you have some special connection to this tradition, or that you think there's wisdom in parts of this tradition that's especially meaningful to you. For example, you might think that without the tradition of prophetic emphasis on social justice and human dignity, that there would be no universal declaration of human rights at all. You may think that the modern rights that we have are secularized versions of religious rights. But it's also, in my view, completely fine to say, I'm fully secular, I'm godless in that sense, I'm not that interested in the Bible, and my source of moral principles is modern secular humanist thought, and if you're going to go there, then the Declaration of Human Rights is not a bad place to start. I think it's totally reasonable. I'm in full support of anyone who wants to say that is their identity and those are their beliefs. And that can be Jewish too. There's an aspiration to universalism that is very identifiably and often distinctively Jewish. Audrey Thacker asks about secularism. I think I've already said a little bit about what secular means. I think if you're talking about a secular government, it's often a government that doesn't take a stand on religion one way or the other. But if we're talking about individuals who think of themselves as secular in the sense that Zionism was secular, they're usually, at least in principle, people who say, God is not part of this picture. And indeed, someone who says, I'm genuinely secular, and then says, but I go to synagogue every day, needs to explain the relationship between those two ideas. They might mean to say that they don't believe in God, but they like the tradition and they feel connected to the tradition. But in some sense, the way they're living is actually not especially secular. Madeline Edelman asks, what do I make of the purity, politics, or rejection approach that seeks to exclude anyone that does not embrace their specific take on Jewishness, rather than embracing the struggle? Well, I guess I would say two things, Madeline. The first is, I'm not on their team. I believe that many different manifestations of Jewishness are legitimately Jewish, even the ones that I think are really wrong, and even the tiny number of them that in my judgment would cross over into actually being bad, like some of the extremist Jewish supremacist movements that do exist in the world, including in Israel, that take a stand that actually thinks that Jews' lives matter more or are more valuable, or that Jews have greater cosmic value as individuals than do non-Jews. I really couldn't disagree more profoundly with those points of view, and they are also Jewish. And they are legitimately Jewish, even though I don't think they're right. But the other thing I would say is, my view that those movements are genuinely and traditionally legitimately Jewish does entail my having to say that I'm not right about Jewishness. There is a long tradition of saying Jewishness is what I think it is. And for me to argue for pluralist Judaism, I have to be open to those forms of Judaism that say, Feldman, you're completely wrong. There's just one version of being Jewish, and it's my version, and it's not yours. And so I'm like a bit like the rabbi in the joke, with two people in arguing in front of him, and one says, "I'm right," and the rabbi listens to him and says, "I heard your side of the story. You are right." And then the other guy tells his side of the story, and the rabbi says to them, "You know what? You're right." And then a third guy stands there and says, "Well, what do you mean? They can't both be right." And the rabbi says, "You're right too." I love that joke because it's kind of a Zen koan. It explains what's hard about being genuinely pluralist as a Jew, because you have to accept the legitimacy of the point of view that denies the legitimacy of your own point of view. And that is, in some sense, a paradox. Dory Sanders asks, how would you respond to a comment made to me by a Reform rabbi who said that anyone struggling with the Israeli response to October 7 is anti-Semitic? And Dory says that took her breath away and was deeply hurtful and confusing. Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that that response takes my breath away, but I guess what I would say is this. It is the most Jewish thing in the world to struggle and to try to make sense of the correct ethical path to take in the face of difficult circumstances. And so to me, to struggle with the horrors of October 7, to struggle with the deaths of, by any account, including the Israeli government's account, tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians who were not Hamas or Islamic Jihad, to struggle with that reality is also profoundly and deeply Jewish. And I don't think it's anti-Semitic to struggle with those things or to admit that there are things that one struggles with. And if it were the case that made you anti-Semitic, large numbers of people living in Israel today and serving in the IDF and fighting and dying in Gaza would themselves be anti-Semitic. And so I reject the idea that that would be anti-Semitic. It's also true that in the criticism of Israel that's been very prominent all over the world, including, I would say, on my own campus after October 7, there are instances in which what I take to be completely legitimate concerns with Israel's actions and completely legitimate criticisms of Israel have veered into territory that I would consider anti-Semitic by essentializing Israel or essentializing Jews or condemning Jews as inherently white supremacist or as the state of Israel as inherently genocidal. To be clear, that's different than having a reasoned argument about whether Israel's actions in Gaza satisfy the international standards for war crimes. The International Court of Justice has said there's a possibility, a plausibility that that's the case, and they're adjudicating it. The International Criminal Court has now charged Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, with war crimes, not with genocide, but with other war crimes. I think that the ICJ charges, in my own view of international law, should not be upheld. I don't think that that's the correct holding, given the facts as we have them. I think it's a harder case for Netanyahu and Gallant, but to me, on the closest reading of the evidence that I'm familiar with, doesn't appear convincing to me beyond a reasonable doubt that they have committed war crimes. That's my view. I think it's possible to take on those views without inherently being anti-Semitic. But it's also possible to hold those views in conjunction with genuine anti-Semitism. And so to be, as we say in Hebrew, dan l'chaf, to try to judge people with merit, perhaps, Dory, perhaps the rabbi you were speaking to was troubled by instances of real anti-Semitism and then was overgeneralizing. Let's hope that that's the case, at least. That's, I think, the charitable reading. Sean Klein asks, is the progressive view of Jewishness as liberal social justice too thin? If so, does your view of the core of Jewishness as love and struggle show how this can be made deeper? I don't think I would want to criticize it as too thin, but I think it would be too thin without the love and without the struggle. Does that sound right? I mean, social justice is always thin if it thinks it has all the answers immediately. A person who is a social justice warrior, if you will, who says, I know the right answer to every question. I condemn everyone else who does not share my views as immoral, that's too thin a conception of what social justice entails. True social justice entails acknowledging there are competing interpretations of the right way to live, and that different people have different perspectives on them, and that they can sincerely and genuinely be trying to act for the good, and yet be diametrically opposed to each other. And that happens all the time, and it especially happens among Jews. And so to me, to have the emotional and the affective dimension of love and the honesty to admit that we're engaged in struggle thickens and makes more complex that experience. And then I think it can be the case that progressive Jewishness can be a very rich and thick way of being. It sometimes struggles with the ritual aspect. It's hard to sustain communal Jewish life with no ritual, and almost no one tries. Even the most secular Jews still, even people who say, well, the only Jewish thing I do is go to the Israel Day parade, well, that's a ritual, But very few Jews even would go that far. Many will gather for an evening meal on Passover or on Rosh Hashanah or a Sabbath meal. Those are ritual engagements because they're necessary to create human connection. And so in that sense, progressive Judaism, compared to the other movements, can sometimes struggle with the ritual aspect, but it also provides ritual that can be deeply meaningful for people. So especially if we're creative and open-minded about the evolution of that ritual, I think it can come out okay. I will say that in many Reform and conservative and Reconstructionist temples around the country, the trend that will give the ritual more meaning is a trend that acknowledges contemporary general American spiritual life, which is interested in some of the things that Jewish tradition has to offer. It's interested in angels, because angels are in Judaism. If you sang Shalom Aleichem, you sung to the angels. It's interested in astrology. Astrology is in Judaism. If you've ever said Mazel Tov to anyone, you've wished that some event occur under a favorable astrological sign. Jewish tradition entails the whole range of mystical experience that many young people are looking for today. And I think to make the ritual meaningful in progressive temples, it's very valuable to be open to those aspects of the tradition and not only to the rationalistic aspects of the tradition. Kathy Youngman asks, Kathy Youngman just says something very nice to me. She says, thanks for helping us to better understand feelings about Israel, where a lot of her family lives, and giving her a better context with which to talk to my son. Kathy, thank you for writing that. I appreciate it. Mark R. asks, I haven't read the book yet, which is totally great, but I assume that your exploration of why Jew hatred didn't disappear after the establishment of modern Israel acknowledges that it's not because of the Palestinians. It's more complicated and more simple. The 50 years after World War II had slightly less Jew hatred than the past 2,000 years. That was the anomaly and was destined to revert to the norm. Yeah, I agree with part of that. And in fact, in addition to talking about this extensively in the book, I also wrote a cover story for Time magazine last February on the new anti-Semitism, where I tried to explore precisely the question of the relationship between ancient anti-Semitism, medieval anti-Semitism, early modern anti-Semitism, 19th century anti-Semitism, all of which are different from each other, though they have certain things in common, and the contemporary version of that. But yes, I will say, Mark, that as I was commenting a bit earlier, one of the reasons that anti-Semitism has never disappeared and can never really disappear as long as there is Christianity and Islam in the world is that the origin stories of those traditions are bound up in an interaction with, and in some sense, a rejection of Judaism. Jesus is a Jew in the Gospels, but he's also a Jew who is condemned to death by the Sanhedrin, even if it's the Romans who carry out his execution. And the Prophet Muhammad in Islam has a very complicated relationship with Jews in the Quran and in other classical Islamic sources. On the one hand, Jews are included in the community in Medina. On the other hand, he's constantly polemicizing against the Jews that they've gotten it wrong and they've let God down and that they've distorted the Bible, which is one of the reasons that in Islam there are differences between the Quran and the Bible because they should say the same thing. So if they don't, it must be that the Bible was distorted. So given the richness of those traditions and their importance in so many people's lives, it's basically impossible to disentangle any anti-Semitism from those traditions, although brave people have tried. If you think of the distance that Christianity has come just in the last 60 or 70 years, it's given up. Mainstream Christianity has given up many, many, many teachings that were at the core of anti-Semitism for, well over 1,000 years. And so I don't say that progress is impossible. I think it is possible. But a full and total moving beyond anti-Semitism may not be. Linda Elias asks, a Christian friend of mine coming from the hills of Tennessee, the soulful hills of Tennessee, asked if Judaism is a race or a religion. And she says, I'm flummoxed by the origin of this question, as she learned of the query from the pulpit. That's from Lindy from Tucson. Well, Lindy, the fact that you're flummoxed is a sign of how successful Jews were in the United States in shifting the standard language of the 19th century, which was that Jews were a race, into the idea that Judaism is a religion. Now, what's a race? The word race is a product of 19th century race science, and I use scare quotes because race science is what we would today call a pseudoscience, though it's what qualified as a science in the 19th century. And it postulated, just as in the case of people of African origin, people of Asian origin, that there were things called races, which, according to some theories at least, led to different creation acts by God. On other theories, there was a single creation act and then separation of these races. And in that conception, Jews were thought of as a separate race. And it took time and substantial effort for Jews in the United States to argue that they were not members of a separate race, but were, in fact, white people. You can imagine if you came to the United States in the 1880s or the 1890s, some Jews, of course, came earlier, but this argument sort of happened in that period and afterwards, and you saw the United States, it would become very clear that the one thing you didn't want to be was a member of a non-white race, because in those years, legalized segregation existed in a substantial part of the United States. So that's how that changed. And I will just add that it's not unique to the Jews. Irish people, Celts, were considered to be a separate race in some forms of discourse. And there's actually a famous historical book called How the Irish Became White, describing how Irish racial identity got transmuted into whiteness. And there are other examples too. Slavs were considered to be a member of a Slavic race, according to 19th century race science, and so forth and so on. So that's the answer to your question. So your friend is not being a racist. Your friend is just asking a question that reflects a form of language that existed for a long time. Kathy, who's back again with time with the question, says, Kathy Youngman says, how much of Judaism is a bond of rituals, bringing people together to celebrate? It seems the joys of rituals are the heart of our Jewish communities. I guess I would answer, Kathy, that the rituals are a hugely important part of our Jewish life. And some of those rituals are communal in the temple or in the synagogue, and a lot of them are in the home, where they are really familial. And those rituals can include just sitting down to dinner together on Shabbat in the evening or for lunch on Shabbat. It can be a very simple ritual, and it can be a ritual without any prayers attached to it. But if your family chooses to do that on a regular basis, or even an irregular basis, then yes, I think you're at the core of the celebratory part of being Jewish. But it's also true that something that all the forms of Jewishness have in common is that they want to offer some account of what it is to be Jewish, even when you're not doing a formal celebration. There's some way in which you're Jewish when they wake you up at 4 in the morning, and the different movements have different ways of thinking, or the different approaches have different ways of thinking about what makes you Jewish in that way. For a cultural Jew, it might be your cultural style. For a Zionist Jew, it might be your identification with the state of Israel. For a believing Jew, it might be some relationship that you have with the divine, even when you're not engaged in worship. But all of them are seeking something that is grounded in those celebrations and rituals, but also goes beyond. Leon Igras asks me about Claudine Gay's resignation as the president of Harvard. You're asking me about my boss, my bosses, my former boss, my current boss, and I will say, as a person who loves my university and has worked in my university for a long time, that almost all of us within the university were really sad that such an important part of the life of the university involved active intervention by congressional committees that intentionally tried to ask, we're seeking the scalps of university presidents, and then the intervention of other people from the outside. That's not great for the health of a university in the long run, no matter whether you think, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that Claudine, I wrote this, that Claudine Gay's answers to the committee were not the answers that she should have given, nor were the answers of the other presidents, the answers that I think they would have been best off giving. But yeah, that happened. Okay, last question. Rabia Ben Halim asks, how do you think Gen Z's understanding of Israel and the older generation's perspective can be reconciled? That's a great question. I don't think it's that easy, Rabia. I don't think it's that, those are not that easy to reconcile. I think the common ground between them is a deep commitment among progressive Jews, at least, to a Judaism of social justice. And so then the possibility of reconciliation really depends on the possibility of a solution to the Israel-Palestine problem. At one time, I would have told you that that solution was a two-state solution in which there would be an independent Palestinian state in which Palestinians would have full civil and political rights and the right of return, at least there, and perhaps some to places within Israel where their families had fled or been expelled from at different times. And I think that might have reconciled those generations. Certainly the progressive Jews who are in the parents' generation, the Gen X and Boomer Jews, those progressive Jews overwhelmingly supported and would still support the creation of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. The difficulty is, as you know, that in the real world, the two-state solution has come to seem harder and harder and harder to imagine, and that's led people on both sides to call for a one-state solution. The difficulty there is that the two sides have very different conceptions of what a one-state solution would look like. A one-state solution that offered full democratic equality to all of its citizens might well reconcile the two generations. And then the question would be, in what way would that state still be able to be a Jewish state and a homeland for Jews? And that's an extraordinarily difficult question. If the one-state solution were the one that the Israeli right would like, where Palestinians would not have full and equal rights, that's not going to satisfy either of the generations. And to be honest, that might actually reconcile the generations, because that might be something that leads the older generation of Jews with a lot of pain and a lot of anguish to move away from the depth of their support for Israel. I know many, many progressive American Jews who will be genuinely, deeply threatened in their ideas of what to think about being a Jew should mean in relation to Israel if Israel actually annexed parts of the West Bank. Okay, a very, very last question, because I've got 1 minute left here. It's from Sean again. Do you think that most traditionalist Jews would disagree with your view of the core of Jewishness? If so, what do you think the main criticisms from traditionalist Jews would be of my view? Yes, of course they would disagree with parts of it. To traditionalist Jews, the core of Judaism is the acceptance of what the Talmud calls the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. That is, accepting that God exists, God is the sovereign of the universe, and as sovereign commands the Jewish people to follow the 613 commandments of the Torah, and then the interpretation of that commandment proffered by the rabbis and expanded by the rabbis. And what's more, that because one of the commandments is to obey the rabbis, all of the other commandments are also entailed, all of the other rabbinic teachings are entailed within the commandments. And that's the core. However, traditionalist Jews, so to that extent, to the extent that my theory of Jewishness is not restricted to that, I think they would absolutely disagree. On the other hand, if you ask traditionalist Jews about the love, they would agree entirely. Moses Maimonides says that the commandment that I mentioned in the Shema, love the Lord your God, is an affirmative commandment. Now, not all rabbinic authorities agree with that, because it's a little difficult to explain how you can command someone to feel love. But there is a dominant strand in the Jewish tradition, or a strand in the Jewish tradition that does say that we are commanded to love. And love is an emotion. So the idea that love is an important component of Jewishness is shared by traditionalists without any doubt. Traditionalists love God. God, they believe, loves them. And they love one another. And they are also commanded to love the stranger in the Bible. And so they attempt to follow that and love the stranger as well. And as for the struggle, many strands of traditionalism do recognize forms of struggle. They recognize theological struggle, the struggle to try to understand God's ways in the world, and the struggle to justify how God's actions can be just and how to justify horrors like the Holocaust. That's a deep struggle in contemporary traditionalist Judaism with many different and competing answers. And Jews also struggle with what God's law is and with the difficulty of obeying God's law. Traditionalist Judaism recognizes that if you're going to follow each and every one of God's commands and each one of the rabbis' commands, that is very hard work. That is a lifetime of work, and it entails a form of struggle. There's an old Yiddish saying, translating loosely as "it's tough to be a Jew," and that is not only a saying about anti-Semitism, it's also a saying about what it's like internally to be a Jew and the challenges that go with it. And traditionalists fully recognize and acknowledge that. So in that sense, I think traditionalists would not reject my overall conception. They just would think that maybe I was not sufficiently emphasizing what they think of as their genuine core, which is the acknowledgement of divine sovereignty and the commitment to following God's word. And with that, I will thank everybody. Thank you very much for listening and for spending your evening in front of your computer screens. It was a pleasure for me. Thank you for the terrific questions. And thank you, Professor Samuelson and Professor Rothenberg. And thank you, Lisa Kaplan, for organizing. And thank you for having me, everybody.
Great, thank you. Really, this was a very, we're all privileged to spend some time with you. I do have some questions, but I can ask you those questions after we close the event. But I want to remind everybody on the call about two things. Number one, we're going to spend, since we heard so much about love, there's going to be a whole conference on the many faces of love, Judaism, Science, and Medicine. And that's the annual conference that we are doing here every year for Judaism, Science, and Medicine groups. So that's in beginning of March 2nd and 3rd. And maybe we can come back to some of those wonderful comments and insights about the meaning of love. And maybe if I am to pose a question to Professor Feldman, my question would be, how do you educate Jews today to accomplish the sense of loving struggle or struggling love so that they can feel part of the Jewish extended family, as you call it? What would we need to do in education, and can Jewish studies help us in any way?
I mean, I think Jewish studies can help. The first thing I would say is, to teach love, you have to model love. It's easy to model struggle. We all do that every day in one way or another. But we have to be open about our feelings and the love that we feel, and not hide behind the mirage that everything we feel or that we do is based on some formal logical commitment. It's good to begin by saying, listen, I'm going to try to respond to you substantively and intellectually, but I'm having a lot of feelings right now. And feelings are an important part of this, and it's okay that feelings are a part of it. And those feelings include genuine love. And as for the struggle, I think we also can do well by revealing to the next generation that we do have struggles, that we don't have all the right answers, that everything is not so simple. I think especially when Jews feel beleaguered, and I think it's true of every human being when they feel beleaguered, but it includes Jews, we think that the answer to being beleaguered is just to have a unified front and never show any self-doubt, because we think self-doubt would translate into weakness. But that's wrong. The strength of Jewishness comes from introspection. It's a basic part of our annual liturgical cycle. It's what Yom Kippur is about. The Day of Atonement is about introspection and trying to analyze your deeds, and Rosh Hashanah, for that matter, is too, and trying to do better about them in the future. And that means engaging in overt recognition of struggle, as we do in the liturgy on those holidays, and as we do when we study. And then that's where Jewish studies comes in. Jewish studies, which is, what probably the field I love the most of all of the different fields of academia that I've been connected to in my life, is the record, the profound record, the deep, and the profound in the sense of deep historically, but also deep substantively, of how Jews have struggled with the crucial ideas of their lives, and how they have loved and not loved through that process. Jewish studies is partly the study of the history of Jewish ideas, like Professor Samuelson focuses on in her work, but it's also the story of Jewish lives and Jewish experiences, and yes, of Jewish affects and emotions. Those are also part of the subjects of Jewish studies. So that can enable us to see connections to the ways Jews have lived and the ways Jews are presently living. And it can be provide some of the raw material to help us make meaning and sense out of our own lives.
I appreciate that's very that's I couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly how I see it. In other words, we should use the word culture maybe more centrally in the way you try to explain
Yes.
why remain
Culture, it's all of it. It's ideas, it's culture, and it's experience. And we shouldn't be afraid to say that if something happened a long time ago, well, we can't know what the experience was like. No, we can't know exactly what the experience was like. In the same way, we can't know exactly what a medieval philosopher meant by every word in his treatise, but we can do our best in light of the materials available to us to reconstruct a sense of what Jewish experience was like, Jewish belief was like, Jewish life was like, just like we can try to do it for Jewish ideas. It's not easy to do, but it's the challenge. And I think also for almost every professor that I've ever met in Jewish studies and every professional in Jewish studies, we don't only do it because we're, we definitely don't do it because we're looking for a paycheck. It's not a way to get rich. We don't only do it because we're interested in a cold, abstract academic subject. We do it because we have some emotional or affective connection ourselves to the material. And instead, we shouldn't be embarrassed by that. We shouldn't say, oh, well, the people over in the, sociology department, they have no emotional affective connection to their subject. Yes, they do. And so do the people in all the other departments of history and philosophy and ethnic studies and religious studies. That's why humans are motivated to do academia. And we don't we think we do a service when we pretend that that's not the case, and we don't. We make our endeavors less easy to understand. And if we were studying people in the past and we ignored their commitments, their feelings, their experiences, that would make us bad scholars. So we shouldn't do to ourselves what we wouldn't do to the subjects of our study in the past.
Yes, indeed. So all of us are going to celebrate Hanukkah coming up, whatever it is, 10 days or so. So I wish you all happy Hanukkah, or in Hebrew, Chag Urim Sameach. And thanks again for this very enlightening and emotionally meaningful lecture. So good night, everyone, and we'll see you in other activities of Jewish studies in the coming year of 2025. Thank you.
Thank you so much.